On a gray Tuesday morning, the courthouse in Maplewood County, Ohio, looked almost ordinary from the outside. Its sandstone columns rose steadily against a low, overcast sky. But inside, the air hummed with an energy everyone could feel, part curiosity, part dread, and part the simple weight of justice about to unfold. Reporters arrived early, carrying notebooks and small cameras. They weren't expecting a sensational murder or a major political scandal today. This was a burglary case, technically routine, but there was one unusual factor that had drawn extra eyes. A 3-year-old girl listed as a witness. The hallway outside Courtroom 3 was unusually still. A few people whispered while sipping coffee from paper cups, careful not to be loud in the hushed building. The Carter family sat on a wooden bench near the door. Sarah Carter, the mother, looked pale and exhausted. She kept brushing her daughter's light brown curls with trembling fingers. Her husband, David Carter, sat beside them, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the floor. Between them sat their youngest child, Emily, a tiny girl in a pink cardigan, holding a worn gray stuffed bunny with long floppy ears. Emily swung her feet nervously, shoes not quite touching the ground. Sarah had worried all night. Emily barely slept. Every time the little girl stirred, she whimpered and pressed closer to her mother. Sarah wondered if bringing her here was a mistake. But the prosecutor had been gentle yet firm. Emily might remember something no one else could. A child had been present the night. A stranger entered their home. And even though she was only 3, she had said things during early interviews that seemed oddly clear. Still, Sarah doubted her daughter could speak in front of strangers, especially the man who had terrified them. The defendant, Mark Talbot, waited inside the courtroom with his defense attorney. Talbot looked like many men might after weeks in custody, tired but trying to appear unbothered. He wore a wrinkled suit that didn't quite fit, his hands folded in his lap. The burglary he was accused of had frightened the whole Carter household. It had happened 6 months earlier, just after midnight. David and Sarah had been asleep upstairs, Emily in her small bedroom across the hall. A crash had woken Sarah. By the time David rushed downstairs, someone was running out the back door. Nothing major was stolen, but the back door had been jimmied open and a purse emptied onto the kitchen floor. The scariest part was that Emily had apparently been awake long enough to see a figure moving in the dark. David had grabbed a baseball bat that night and tried to follow, but the man was gone. Police later found footprints in the mud, and a glove dropped near the fence. That glove, along with other evidence, eventually led them to Talbot. But the defense had argued the case was circumstantial. No fingerprints, no eyewitness besides a toddler. And a toddler, they said, could easily be mistaken. Inside Courtroom 3, the prosecutor, Claire Dawson, organized her papers with meticulous calm. She knew the case wasn't airtight. Emily was their secret hope, not to give perfect testimony, but to humanize the event, to help the jury feel the fear this family had lived with. Yet Claire worried about putting a child on the stand. The judge had allowed it after several evaluations, but warned that questioning must be gentle. At precisely 9 o'clock, the bailiff opened the heavy double doors. The crowd shuffled in. The Carters sat in the first row behind the prosecutor's table. David placed an arm protectively around Sarah's shoulders. Emily stayed on Sarah's lap, wide-eyed but silent. She clutched Bunny so hard that one of its ears twisted backward. The judge, Honorable William Keaton, entered and called the room to order. Keaton was known for his calm patience and quiet warmth, especially in delicate cases. He had allowed a unique request today, something unusual that had piqued reporters' interest. A police dog would be present during testimony. Therapy animals had occasionally been used to comfort child witnesses, but this was different. This was a working K-9 officer. A murmur rippled through the benches when the side door opened, and Officer James Miller stepped in, wearing his dark blue uniform. Beside him padded a large German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes and a shiny black and tan coat. The dog moved with silent confidence, neither nervous nor aggressive, just steady. His vest bore a patch with a single name, Ruger. Some jurors exchanged quick, curious glances. A few smiled unconsciously. There was something comforting about the calm animal. Emily's small face peeked over her mother's shoulder. For a second, she forgot to be scared. Her lips moved silently. "Doggy." Sarah stroked her daughter's back, whispering, "It's okay, sweetie." Officer Miller took a seat near the witness stand, Ruger curling at his feet. The dog settled quickly, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. The bailiff explained that Ruger was a trained canine present to help keep the witness calm. The judge nodded in approval and added, "We're here to find the truth while making this process safe for everyone involved, especially our youngest witness." The trial began with opening statements. Claire Dawson spoke first, painting a picture of an ordinary family home violated by an intruder. She described Sarah waking to noises, David rushing downstairs, and the small but chilling details: a purse dumped on the kitchen tiles, muddy prints across the rug. Then she mentioned Emily. Our youngest witness may not know every word, but sometimes truth comes from the purest eyes. The defense attorney, Gregory Lorne, countered by stressing the unreliability of a 3-year-old's memory. "We must be careful," he told the jury, "not to let fear cloud facts." He suggested that Emily might have dreamed parts of that night or confused TV images with real life. Some jurors nodded slightly. Others frowned. Throughout, Emily stayed very quiet on her mother's lap, but she kept stealing glances at Ruger. Each time the big dog's tail gave a small wag or his ears twitched, Emily seemed a little braver, a little less frozen. Her parents noticed, but said nothing. They hoped this was a good sign. When the first witnesses finished, police officers describing evidence collection, neighbors recalling hearing barking, the judge finally called a short recess. After the break, it would be Emily's turn. Sarah's hands shook as she adjusted her daughter's sweater. "Remember, Mommy's right here," she whispered. Emily nodded but didn't speak. David squeezed Sarah's shoulder. His face was tight, but full of quiet resolve. Officer Miller walked over slowly, letting Ruger's presence fill the space without pressure. Ruger didn't lick or jump. He simply sat, gaze calm and friendly. Emily stared back, wide-eyed but unafraid. Across the room, Mark Talbot shifted uncomfortably. His lawyer leaned down to whisper something, but Talbot barely reacted. Maybe he hadn't expected this part to feel so heavy. Maybe he hadn't thought the little girl he once frightened would ever sit just feet away. The reporter scribbled notes. Child witness about to testify. K-9 officer present. Rare sight. Tension high. The judge returned and nodded to the bailiff. "Bring in the witness." Everyone turned as Sarah and David slowly guided Emily to the front. She looked impossibly small beside the towering wooden witness stand. Her bunny dangled from one arm, its ear trailing the polished floor. The bailiff lifted her carefully into the seat and adjusted the microphone so it sat just below her chin. Judge Keaton smiled gently. "Good morning, Emily." The girl whispered something too soft to hear. "That's all right," Keaton said kindly. "You're safe here. Just tell the truth, okay?" Emily nodded. Behind her, Ruger lifted his head slightly, ears perked, but body still relaxed. He didn't make a sound, yet somehow his quiet presence filled the room with unexpected comfort. No one could have known, in that suspended moment, that this silent dog would soon help change the entire course of the trial, and that a tiny voice, hesitant and small, was about to echo louder than anyone imagined. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 3 swung shut with a muted thud as the recess ended. The buzz of conversation that had filled the room during the short break dissolved into silence when the bailiff called everyone to order. The trial had felt like any other small-town burglary case up until now, tense but predictable. That was about to change. The side door near the witness box opened, and Officer James Miller stepped through. He was in full dark blue uniform, the polished brass buttons catching the light. But it wasn't Miller's calm, almost military bearing that made people straighten in their seats. It was the dog padding silently at his heel. Ruger was a German shepherd, large but not menacing. His coat was a mix of rich sable and deep black, glossy under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. A leather harness encircled his chest, stamped with his name in block letters, Ruger. On one side, a gold police badge gleamed. He walked with quiet precision, his paws barely making a sound on the polished floor. Some of the jurors blinked in surprise. A few in the back row leaned forward instinctively, their eyes softening. Everyone expected guard dogs to be imposing or loud. Ruger was neither. He moved with controlled grace, exuding calm authority rather than aggression. His tail swayed once, a subtle motion that seemed to say he was aware of everyone, but threatened no one. The Carter family noticed first. Little Emily, sitting between her parents at the prosecution's table, stopped fidgeting with her bunny and stared. Her big brown eyes followed the dog's every step. For the first time that morning, something besides fear lit her face, curiosity. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Sarah felt her daughter's small body relax just a little against her side. David noticed too. His tense jaw eased for a brief second. Officer Miller guided Ruger to a spot near the witness stand. Close enough that Emily would be able to see him clearly when she testified, but not so close that the jury would think the dog was there to intimidate anyone. Ruger lowered himself into a sphinx-like pose, front paws stretched neatly forward, head high but relaxed. After a quick glance around the room, he sighed softly and placed his chin on his paws. It was a small, almost imperceptible signal. I am here. You're safe. Judge Keaton cleared his throat and addressed the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said in his measured, calm voice, you may have noticed our unusual guest. This is Ruger, a certified canine officer with the Maplewood Police Department. Officer Miller and Ruger are here with the court's permission for one purpose, to help ensure that our youngest witness feels safe enough to speak. Ruger is highly trained and will remain calm and unobtrusive. He is not here to influence testimony, only to provide comfort. Some jurors nodded, intrigued. A few looked touched. The defense attorney, Gregory Lorne, stood briefly. Your Honor, just for the record, we maintain our earlier objection. The presence of a police dog could prejudice the jury. His voice was polite, but tight. Keaton met his gaze evenly. Objection noted and overruled. The jury will be instructed that Ruger's presence should not be seen as proof of anything. It's strictly for the comfort of a child witness. Lorne sat, hiding his irritation behind a neutral expression. He knew a gentle dog wasn't likely to sway jurors consciously, but there was no denying the emotional weight Ruger brought into the room. Officer Miller didn't speak unless asked. His posture was steady, hands clasped behind his back. He had been a canine handler for 8 years and knew exactly how to make Ruger's presence soothing rather than dramatic. Quietly, he gave a single-hand signal. Ruger shifted his weight, ears flicking forward briefly, then relaxed again. The prosecutor, Claire Dawson, stole a glance at Emily. The change was unmistakable. The little girl still looked shy. Who wouldn't? But the terror that had clung to her that morning seemed to loosen. Her gaze lingered on Ruger with an almost childlike fascination. The German shepherd looked back with gentle, unblinking patience. No wagging, no licking, just calm reassurance. Claire felt a tiny swell of hope. She had spent weeks worrying that Emily might freeze on the stand, too frightened to say a word. The child psychologist who prepared Emily for testimony had suggested a comfort animal might help. Therapy dogs weren't unheard of in courtrooms, but Maplewood County had none certified. Then Officer Miller had stepped up, volunteering Ruger, a working police dog, yes, but also famously gentle with children. The judge had surprised everyone by saying yes. It was a calculated risk. Ruger's police status could be seen as intimidating, but Miller insisted the dog could switch from working mode to calm mode with a single cue. Today, Ruger's task wasn't to sniff out drugs or chase suspects. It was simply to be a steady, silent anchor. The prosecutor began calling the morning's witnesses. A neighbor who'd heard barking, the officer who'd lifted muddy shoe prints from the Carter's kitchen tile, a crime scene technician who logged the dropped glove. The testimony was important, but technical. Jurors listened politely, though some seemed restless. Through it all, Emily peeked at Ruger again and again. At one point, she leaned toward her mother and whispered, "Doggie's sleepy." Sarah managed a soft smile for the first time all day. "Yes, sweetheart. He's here to help you." When Officer Miller was briefly sworn in to explain Ruger's purpose, the jury got a closer look at the dog's training. Miller described how Ruger could work in chaotic environments, crime scenes, schools, even hospitals. He explained gently that Ruger was trained to sit quietly with victims or witnesses when needed. "He knows when to be still," Miller said, giving Ruger the lightest pat. The dog didn't even lift his head, only flicked an ear. Jurors chuckled quietly at the dog's perfect composure. Even Judge Keaton allowed himself the faintest smile. The tension in the room eased, if only slightly. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Claire Dawson stood and said softly, "The prosecution calls Emily Carter." A collective hush fell over the courtroom. Chairs shifted. Someone coughed nervously. Sarah and David rose with their daughter. Emily's bunny dangled from one arm, its head brushing the floor as she shuffled forward. Sarah whispered encouragement, while David placed a steadying hand on her small back. When they reached the stand, the bailiff, a gentle-faced man named Carl, crouched slightly to meet Emily's eyes. "Hi there," he said kindly. "I'm going to help you sit up here, okay?" Emily nodded, barely. Carl lifted her gently, placing her on the padded seat. The microphone was lowered to her chin. She blinked at it, fascinated for a second, then turned almost immediately toward Ruger. The dog had shifted just enough so that she could see him clearly. His amber eyes met hers with quiet understanding. Something almost imperceptible passed between them. Emily exhaled, the smallest sigh of relief. Judge Keaton leaned forward, smiling. "Hello, Emily. How are you today?" Emily hesitated and whispered, "Hi." "That's good," Keaton said softly. "We're all here to listen to you. You can hold your bunny if you want. And you see Ruger over there? He's here to help you feel safe." Emily glanced at Ruger, then back to the judge. She gave the tiniest nod. Claire Dawson stepped closer, but kept her tone gentle, as if speaking to her own niece. "Hi, Emily. Do you remember me? I talked to you and your mommy before?" Emily nodded again, squeezing Bunny. "Good. I'm going to ask you a few easy questions. If you don't know or don't want to answer, you can say so. Is that okay?" "Yes," Emily whispered. Claire smiled warmly. "Perfect. Can you tell me, do you know what it means to tell the truth?" Emily thought, then said softly, "Means not lying." "That's right," the judge said kindly. "That's all we ask, just the truth." From the defense table, Gregory Lawrence studied the scene with narrowed eyes. The jury was already leaning forward, drawn in by the innocence of the small witness and the unusual but comforting presence of the big dog at her feet. Lorne scribbled notes furiously, but he could feel momentum shifting, not in evidence yet, but in emotion. And emotion could matter more than facts in a jury's heart. The questioning had just begun. The little girl was still shy, her answers barely above a whisper. But every time she faltered, her eyes flicked toward Ruger, and something steadied in her. No one yet realized how deeply that connection might run, or how, in just a few minutes, it would lead to a single quiet whisper that would stop the entire courtroom cold. The air in courtroom 3 felt different once Emily Carter was settled in the witness chair. The room was hushed, but it wasn't the respectful quiet of routine proceedings. It was the kind of silence that comes when everyone knows something delicate is unfolding, and no one dares disturb it. Emily looked impossibly small against the tall oak back of the witness stand. Her feet dangled well above the polished floor. The bunny in her arms seemed nearly her size. The microphone sat inches from her lips, a strange, shiny object she studied with timid curiosity. She stole a glance at her parents. Sarah sat rigid, but smiling bravely. David gave an almost imperceptible nod that said, "You're safe. We're here." To Emily's left, Ruger lay in his perfect sphinx pose. The big dog's head rested on his paws, but his eyes, those calm amber eyes, stayed fixed on her. Every so often, his tail gave the faintest swish, a soundless reassurance only a child might notice. Emily had never been around police dogs before. They'd always looked huge and scary on TV, but Ruger didn't feel scary. Ruger felt good. Judge Keaton leaned slightly forward, his voice gentle. "Emily, can you tell me your name?" The little girl hesitated. The microphone loomed in front of her. Dozens of strangers watched. But then her eyes slid to Ruger. His ears twitched, and somehow that was enough. "Emily," she whispered. The judge smiled warmly. "Emily, that's a pretty name. And you're holding a bunny there. What's the bunny's name?" She blinked, then whispered, "Mr. Flop." Soft chuckles broke the tension. Even a couple of jurors smiled. Keaton nodded. "Mr. Flop. Good. You can keep him with you the whole time." Claire Dawson, the prosecutor, stood and stepped forward slowly so as not to loom. She kept her voice calm and friendly. "Hi again, Emily. Remember me?" Emily nodded. "Do you remember we talked about telling the truth?" "Yes. Good girl. That's what we'll do today. I'm going to ask you some questions about a night that was a little scary. If you don't remember, you can say so. If you want to stop, just say stop. Okay?" Emily squeezed Mr. Flop, but nodded again. Claire glanced briefly at the jury. Several were leaning forward, clearly touched by the care being taken. Then she began softly, building trust. "Emily, can you tell us where you live?" Emily gave her street name in a barely audible voice. Claire smiled, reassured. The child was talking, even if quiet. "Do you remember a night when you heard noises in your house?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "What were you doing before you heard them?" Emily's brow furrowed as she thought. "Sleeping," she said softly. "But woke up. Do you remember why you woke up?" The little girl's voice faltered. She glanced toward her parents, then down at Mr. Flop. For a second, it seemed she might shut down. Claire paused, not pushing. And then, Emily's eyes found Ruger. The German shepherd hadn't moved, but his gaze was steady and warm. To Emily, it was like looking into a pair of gentle lanterns in the dark. Her breathing slowed. She touched Mr. Flop's ear and whispered, "I heard." "Door? A door?" Claire echoed gently. Emily nodded. "Down." "Stairs." The jury listened intently now. Claire kept her voice neutral, letting the child lead. "Did you hear anything else?" "Foots," Emily said after a long pause. "Footsteps?" Emily nodded again. "And dog." A ripple went through the room. Claire's head tilted slightly. She hadn't expected that detail this soon. You heard a dog that night? Emily hesitated but nodded. Bark, loud, bad man run. The defense attorney, Gregory Lorne, straightened in his chair, scribbling notes. The dog bark detail had been in police reports. A neighbor's Labrador had barked wildly that night, but no one had coached Emily on it. This was coming straight from her memory. Claire's expression stayed calm, but inwardly she felt hope flicker. Emily, when you say bad man, what do you mean? The toddler shifted, suddenly shy again. Her free hand reached toward the edge of the stand, tiny fingers curling against the wood. Then she looked at Ruger, his head tilted ever so slightly, ears lifting in quiet curiosity. Something in Emily changed, a visible, almost physical unfreezing. Her little shoulders squared. She leaned closer to the microphone, eyes still on the dog, and said in a whisper just loud enough to carry, "Bad man." The two words were soft, but in the charged stillness of the courtroom, they landed like a crack of thunder. The judge's eyebrows rose. Jurors exchanged looks. A reporter's pen scratched furiously across paper. Claire didn't speak right away. She knew instinctively not to break the spell. Even the defense lawyer froze for a heartbeat, then quickly rose. Objection, leading. But Judge Keaton raised a hand, stopping him mid-word. Overruled. The child's statement was not prompted. His tone was quiet but firm. Emily's gaze broke from Ruger and shifted slowly, unbearably slowly, across the courtroom until it landed on the defendant's table. She didn't point, not yet, but her whole body seemed to lean that way. Her lips trembled. Claire crouched slightly to be at Emily's level. Emily, can you tell us about the bad man? The little girl didn't answer at first. The courtroom held its collective breath. Then, in the smallest voice, but with surprising clarity, she said, "He was." "In my house," gasps whispered through the benches. Claire swallowed her own surge of emotion. "You saw him?" Emily nodded. "Where was he?" "Downstairs." "Kitchen," she whispered. "He took Mommy's purse." Dropped things. The details matched police photos. Coins spilled across tile. A wallet thrown open. And then what happened? Emily paused. Her small fingers twisted Mr. Flop's ear. Then she looked to Ruger again. The dog blinked slowly, calm and unflinching. Emily took a breath. Dog bark. He run. Claire let the silence sit. The jury seemed spellbound. This was far more detail than they dared hope for. Then Emily did something unexpected. She turned, lifted one tiny arm, and pointed across the room, directly at Mark Talbot. "That man," she said softly. The effect was electric. The courtroom seemed to inhale all at once. Sarah let out an audible gasp, quickly covering her mouth. David's arm wrapped around her shoulders, his own eyes wide. Several jurors turned to look at Talbot, then back at the child. Even the judge sat straighter, face carefully neutral, but eyes sharpened. Talbot shifted uncomfortably under the collective gaze. His lawyer touched his arm, whispering urgently, but the man looked pale. Claire kept her voice calm, though her pulse raced. "Emily, how do you know that's the man?" The little girl answered simply, "He same. I saw. Do you remember anything about him?" Emily nodded again, her memory coming alive now that she felt safe. Big shoes, black jacket, smelled bad. Another juror scribbled a note. Police had documented a torn black jacket and muddy size 11 boot prints. No one had fed Emily those specifics. Gregory Lorne jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is prejudicial. The witness is 3, her memory is unreliable." Judge Keaton raised a calming hand. "Counsel, you'll have a chance to cross-examine." "Sit down." Lorne sat slowly, frustration clear. Claire smiled gently at Emily. You're doing so well. One last question, sweetie. Do you feel safe now? Emily looked at Ruger, then at her parents, and for the first time that day, she gave a small but definite nod. Claire straightened, turning briefly toward the jury before addressing the court. No further questions at this time. The prosecutor's table exhaled as if they'd been holding their breath for 20 minutes straight. Sarah dabbed at tears she hadn't realized were falling. David pulled her closer, whispering something only she could hear. On the bench, a young juror blinked hard and looked away for a second, clearly moved. And near the witness box, Ruger remained perfectly still, a silent sentinel. He hadn't barked, hadn't moved more than an inch. Yet somehow his quiet presence had coaxed a terrified toddler into speaking truth to a room full of strangers and the man who'd once terrified her. The defense would have its turn to question Emily next, and everyone knew Gregory Lorne would try to poke holes in the memory of a 3-year-old. But the tide had shifted in a way no one could ignore. The jury had just watched a frightened child gather courage in real time, and they had seen the moment trust replaced fear. Even the reporters sensed the gravity. They scribbled notes furiously. Child breaks silence, says bad man, points at defendant. Courtroom breathless. One quietly texted an editor. We have a story here. Emily sat very still as the judge announced a short break before cross-examination. She was pale but calm now, still clutching Mr. Flop. Her tiny fingers reached down from the chair, just enough to brush Ruger's fur. The dog didn't move, only flicked an ear as if to say, I'm here. For the first time since the night her family was broken into, Emily's small world seemed to feel safe again. The break was short but heavy. Jurors shifted in their seats. Reporters whispered behind laptops. Sarah and David Carter clung to each other quietly at the plaintiff's bench. Little Emily sat with a juice box, tiny legs swinging, oblivious to the way her 2 words, bad man, had cracked open the room. When Judge Keaton returned and gavelled the room back to order, defense attorney Gregory Lorne was already on his feet. His sleek navy suit looked deliberate, calm authority mixed with warmth. He forced a small smile, the kind that said, I'm not here to hurt a child. But everyone in the room could feel the steel under it. Mr. Lorne, the judge said evenly, you may proceed with cross-examination. Lorne approached slowly, making a show of lowering himself, so his 6-foot frame didn't tower over the 3-year-old. His voice was smooth, almost sing-song. Hi, Emily. My name's Greg. Do you remember me? Emily's eyes darted to him, then quickly to Ruger. She didn't nod. That's okay, he said gently. I just want to talk a little. You know how sometimes when you wake up from a nap, things feel fuzzy? Like a dream? No answer. Emily hugged Mr. Flop closer. You woke up that night, right? It was very dark? She gave the tiniest nod. And when it's dark, it can be hard to see clearly, can't it? Emily's eyes went to the floor. Lorne looked at the jury, palms up in an of course gesture. Emily, did Mommy or Daddy turn on any lights when you came downstairs? She shook her head slowly. So it was still dark. Emily hesitated, then whispered, Nightlight. Ah. Lorne nodded as though this helped him. A small nightlight. That doesn't make things very bright, does it? No. Some jurors scribbled notes. Others looked skeptical, but listened. Lorne continued, voice gentle but deliberate. You said you saw a man. Was he close to you? Emily's brow wrinkled. Kitchen. And where were you? Steps. So you were far away, on the stairs? She nodded. And you only saw him for a second? Emily didn't answer right away. She peeked at Ruger. The dog blinked slowly, steady as ever. She took a breath. Little bit, she whispered. Little bit. And you were scared? Yes, very scared? She nodded again. Lauren straightened slightly, looking at the jury. Fear can make our brains do funny things. Sometimes when we're scared, we think we see something, but we're wrong. Right, Emily? Claire Dawson objected softly. Argumentative, Your Honor. Sustained, Judge Keaton said. Mr. Lauren, rephrase. Lauren smiled thinly. Of course. Emily, do you remember if the man you saw was wearing a hat? Emily's small face scrunched. No. Don't know. Was he tall? She looked puzzled. Big. Could it have been your daddy? Gasps flared in the gallery. David stiffened. Sarah's eyes flashed. Claire jumped up. Objection. Improper. Judge Keaton frowned. Sustained, Mr. Lauren. I withdraw, Your Honor. Lauren turned back, unruffled. Emily, you were very sleepy, weren't you? Emily nodded reluctantly. Sometimes when we wake up and we're sleepy, we can get confused, right? No answer. The lawyer leaned in just a little. Are you sure? Absolutely sure? That the man you saw was the man sitting over there? His hand swept subtly toward Mark Talbot. All eyes turned to the defendant. A man in his late 30s, heavy-set, eyes downcast. He sat still but tense, jaw locked. Emily's breath caught. Her thumb found Mr. Flop's ear and twisted it nervously. She glanced toward her parents, then Ruger. The shepherd didn't move, just tilted his head the faintest degree. His ears flicked once. Something in the child's posture shifted. A tiny, invisible thread of courage tugged taut again. She looked back at Lauren and, in a small but surprisingly clear voice, said, Yes. The room froze. Lauren blinked, caught off guard by the firmness in that single word. He recovered quickly, masking surprise with a smile. You're sure? Okay. Emily, do you know how long ago that night was? She shrugged. It was almost a year ago, he said softly. That's a long time for a little girl. Do you remember what you had for breakfast last week? Giggles broke out among a few jurors. Lauren smiled as if proving a point. Emily frowned, clearly unsure why this man was asking about breakfast. See? Lauren said, pivoting to the jury. Memory is tricky. Claire stood. Objection. Counsel is testifying. Sustained, said the judge firmly. Ask a proper question, Mr. Lauren. The defense lawyer changed tack. Emily, did someone show you pictures of my client before today? Emily blinked. No. Did Mommy or Daddy tell you to say he's the bad man? No. Did anyone tell you what to say? She hugged Mr. Flop tighter and shook her head. Lauren paused, eyes narrowing just a fraction. He could feel this wasn't landing well with the jury. The child's quiet certainty was more persuasive than he'd expected. Still, he tried one more angle. Emily, when you pointed at Mr. Talbot, were you just guessing? The little girl's eyes flicked to Ruger. The shepherd held her gaze, calm, unwavering. Then she turned back to the lawyer, and in a voice just loud enough to echo softly across the courtroom, she said, No guess. Something shifted in the room. It wasn't a cheer or a gasp. It was quieter, deeper, a collective. Several jurors sat back. Pens paused mid-note. Sarah bit her lip to stop a sob. David closed his eyes briefly, gratitude washing through him. Lauren held still, lips parting slightly, and for a long moment he had no words. Finally, he straightened, forced a smooth expression, and said, No further questions. It felt like surrender. The atmosphere after, as the judge thanked Emily and excused her, the courtroom exhaled. Reporters scrambled to update leads. Defense can't shake toddler's ID. Jurors exchanged glances that said more than any words. Even the bailiff looked faintly moved. Emily climbed down carefully, Mr. Flop in one hand. As she passed Ruger, the big shepherd shifted just enough to nudge his nose gently against her tiny fingers. She paused, smiled shyly, and gave his fur a soft pat. The dog's tail gave one small thump. Sarah was on her feet instantly, arms scooping her daughter close. David leaned over them both, whispering reassurances. For a moment, they were simply a family, fragile but whole. Judge Keaton called for a recess before closing arguments, his voice measured but not cold. Everyone needed a breath. Claire Dawson stayed at her table, watching the little girl go. Her chest ached with a strange mixture of pride and humility. She hadn't done this alone, not even close. Ruger had done something no legal training could, turned fear into courage. Across the aisle, Gregory Lorne rubbed his forehead. His entire strategy had been to sow doubt about a child's memory. But he'd underestimated how powerful certainty can look when it comes from someone so small, and how authenticity can cut through even the slickest questioning. Mark Talbot sat rigid, jaw clenched. His eyes darted toward the door where Emily and her parents disappeared. For the first time since trial began, the man looked less like a defendant fighting charges, and more like someone staring into the teeth of inevitability. A whisper among the jury, as the jury filed out for the break. One young juror, a woman in her 20s, whispered to another, "You can't fake that." She knew him. The older juror beside her nodded slowly. "Yeah, and the dog thing? I don't know." But she got brave right after she looked at him. "Dogs know," the younger one murmured, half joking, half believing. Ruger's quiet work in the hallway. Deputy Lise Marino, Ruger's handler, crouched beside the shepherd. "Good boy," he whispered, scratching behind the dog's ears. Ruger leaned gently into the touch, calm as always. He didn't understand the details of law or testimony, but he knew the child had needed him, and that was enough. Sarah came over, Emily still clinging to her. Can she say hi?" she asked softly. "Of course," Marino said with a smile. Emily slid down from her mother's arms and approached the shepherd carefully. Ruger stayed still, only lowering his head slightly. Tiny hands patted the thick fur. For the first time all day, Emily's face broke into a genuine, shy smile. "Thank you, Ruger," she whispered, as though the dog could understand every word. Maybe he did. Back in the courtroom, when court reconvened, the tone had shifted. Closing arguments were coming, and everyone sensed the case was no longer just about circumstantial evidence and stolen items. It was about trust, the trust of a child who had faced fear and spoken truth. Claire Dawson would have to weave Emily's courage into a careful, fact-based summation without exploiting the child's pain. Gregory Lorne would try to argue doubt again, but his own cross-examination had cracked. And the jury? They had just witnessed something deeply human, a frightened little girl who found safety in a gentle dog's gaze and said what she'd been too scared to say for nearly a year. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the courthouse windows when Judge Keaton finally called the jury back to their seats. Lunch recess was over. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation. The trial had taken an unexpected emotional turn with Emily's words. Now, all that remained were the closing arguments, each side's final attempt to shape the story the jurors would carry into deliberation. Claire Dawson rises. Claire Dawson stood slowly, smoothing the front of her navy suit. She didn't look flashy or theatrical. She looked steady, like someone who trusted the truth to hold its own. When she turned to face the jury, her voice was warm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "a home is supposed to be the safest place in the world. For Sarah and David Carter, that safety shattered one quiet night when a man broke into their home. He stole property, yes, but worse, he stole their peace." She moved closer to the jury box, keeping her tone conversational, not lecturing. You've seen the evidence. The glove left behind. The shoe prints matched to the defendant's boots. The surveillance video from a nearby gas station placing him in the area that night. These are facts. They are pieces of a puzzle. Then she paused, letting her next words land. But puzzles aren't just about pieces. They're about a picture. And you saw that picture take shape when a little girl, the only eyewitness, came here and faced the scariest room she's ever seen. Several jurors nodded subtly. Claire didn't overplay it. She knew jurors could resent emotional manipulation. Emily is 3. She didn't ask to be here. She didn't ask to remember. But she did. Despite fear, despite darkness, she told you what she saw. A bad man in her kitchen. And when asked if that man was the defendant, she didn't waver. She didn't guess. She told you the truth. Claire gestured gently toward the now empty witness stand, then toward Ruger lying calmly at Officer Miller's feet. She found her courage in the quiet presence of a trained police dog. But courage still had to come from her. No one told her what to say. You saw that. You felt it. She turned slightly, including the Carters in her gaze, without making them spectacle. The defense wants you to believe memory is unreliable, that fear clouds judgment. But sometimes fear sharpens memory. Sometimes, when something terrifying happens, the moment burns into the mind. Emily didn't describe an abstract boogeyman. She saw a man in this courtroom and told you who he was. Claire stepped back, letting the power of silence work for her. Then she spoke softly, with gravity. This case isn't about punishing someone for being unlucky or misunderstood. It's about accountability. It's about a family who deserves to sleep safely again. It's about believing evidence, physical evidence and human truth. When both point to the same man, she let her eyes meet each juror's for a moment. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a whisper from a child who gathered her courage and told you the truth. Claire paused, then concluded with quiet strength. We ask you to find the defendant guilty. When she sat down, the courtroom stayed hushed for several beats, as though everyone needed a breath. Sarah reached over and squeezed David's hand. He squeezed back. Even Judge Keaton's usually impassive face looked a little softened. The defense makes it stand. Gregory Lorne stood next. If he felt the sting of Emily's testimony, he didn't show it. His demeanor was calm, calculated. He began by acknowledging the elephant in the room. First, let me say this. Emily Carter is a brave little girl. We should all respect her courage. But bravery doesn't guarantee accuracy. He took a few steps toward the jury, his voice smooth and measured. Memory, especially a young child's memory, can be fragile. It can be shaped by fear, by suggestion, by the simple passage of time. Emily was half asleep. It was dark, and this happened nearly a year ago. Is it possible she believes what she said? Absolutely. Is it possible she's mistaken? Just as absolutely. Lorne gestured to the evidence table. Look at what we actually know. A glove was found, but it had no DNA match. Shoe prints, similar size, yes, but not uniquely linked to my client. Surveillance shows him in the neighborhood hours before the break-in, but Maplewood is small. Many people pass that gas station. He spread his hands, palms up. The state wants you to connect dots that don't fully connect. They want you to fill gaps with emotion. But your job is not to feel. It's to be sure. Sure beyond a reasonable doubt. His voice dropped a register, intent. Ask yourselves, are you sure the man sitting here is the man Emily saw in the dark? Are you sure those prints and that glove mean only he could have been there? If you have any real doubt, the law says you must vote not guilty. Then, with a final calm look at the jury, he added, sympathy has no place in deliberation. Facts do. And the facts here leave room for doubt. He sat down with a quiet sigh, trying not to betray the fatigue beneath his polished exterior. The judge's instructions, Judge Keaton turned to the jury with his usual clarity. He reminded them of the burden of proof. The state must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. He cautioned them not to let sympathy, anger, or prejudice guide their decision, but also reminded them that testimony, even from a child, is evidence if they find it credible. He addressed Ruger's presence explicitly. You must not let the presence of the K-9 influence your verdict. He was here solely to help a young witness feel safe. The jurors listened intently, some jotting notes. The weight of their task hung in the air. Jury deliberation begins. When the jurors filed out, the courtroom exhaled. It was out of everyone's hands now. Sarah sat motionless, clutching David's arm. It's up to them, she whispered. David kissed the top of her head. She did everything she could. Claire Dawson packed her notes with quiet precision, though her stomach churned. She had tried dozens of cases, but this one was different. So raw, so fragile. On the other side, Gregory Lorne sat very still, pen frozen between his fingers. He knew he'd done what he could, but he also knew jurors are human. Humans remember courage. Officer Miller crouched and gave Ruger a scratch behind the ears. Almost done, Nutty, he murmured. The dog licked his lips, relaxed, and stayed watchful. Inside the jury room, the jurors gathered around a long table. At first, the room was quiet. Then an older man broke the silence. She knew him, he said simply. You could see it. That wasn't coached. A middle-aged woman frowned. But it was dark. And kids, they get things mixed up. Sometimes, said a younger juror, the one who'd whispered before. But did you hear how she said no guess? That hit me. She wasn't playing pretend. Another juror, a retired teacher, nodded. I've seen a lot of kids. They don't stick to a story that's strong unless it's real. Someone else chimed in, pointing to the physical evidence. And the boots. And being in the neighborhood. Not airtight, but all together? They debated for hours, weighing facts against doubt. They reminded each other of the judge's instructions. Reasonable doubt, not any doubt. Gradually, the conversation shifted from maybe to probably to yes. The final holdouts admitted they didn't feel reasonable doubt anymore, just the natural wish not to condemn if wrong. Finally, they took a vote. It was unanimous. The verdict, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the courtroom when the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a decision. Everyone returned to their seats. Sarah gripped David's hand so tightly, her knuckles whitened. Claire stood, composed but pale. Lorne remained still, jaw set. The foreperson handed a folded paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Keaton opened it, scanned briefly, and returned to his formal tone. In the case of the state of Minnesota versus Mark Talbot, the room seemed to stop breathing. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of burglary in the first degree. A soft gasp swept the courtroom. Sarah covered her mouth with both hands as tears spilled over. David pulled her close, relief shaking his shoulders. Claire Dawson closed her eyes for a single second, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then she turned and squeezed Officer Miller's arm in gratitude. Ruger simply lifted his head and thumped his tail once, as though sensing the change. Mark Talbot sat stone still, his face unreadable for a long moment before sagging into resignation. Lorne leaned toward him, whispering something legal and calm, but defeat flickered in the lawyer's eyes. After the verdict, Judge Keaton thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. Reporters raced for the exits, eager to file stories about the tiny witness and the police dog who helped her speak. In the hallway, Sarah knelt to hug Emily tight. You did it, baby, she whispered, voice breaking. You told the truth, Emily, a little bewildered by the sudden rush of adults talking and hugging, turned to Ruger. The big shepherd stepped closer, gentle and patient. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. "Good boy," she said softly. Officer Miller smiled and crouched beside them. "He thinks you're the brave one." Emily looked up, eyes wide. "Me?" "You," Miller said. "You are very brave." David reached out to shake the officer's hand, voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you for bringing him. For everything." Miller shrugged modestly. "Ruger just does what he's trained to do. Help people feel safe." The power of quiet courage, as the Carters finally stepped outside into the cool evening air. A crowd of supporters and local reporters waited. Cameras flashed, but Sarah shielded Emily gently, keeping her close. The little girl clutched Mr. Flop in one hand and waved shyly with the other. She had been terrified. She had been tiny and trembling. But she had told the truth, and the truth had been enough. Back inside, Ruger padded beside Officer Miller toward the exit. The courthouse janitor paused his sweeping to watch the pair pass, shaking his head with quiet admiration. "Good dog," he murmured. And somewhere in that moment, everyone who had been there understood. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with shouting or drama. Sometimes it walks in on four quiet paws, sits patiently beside a frightened child, and gives her the strength to whisper what the world needs to hear. The courthouse emptied slowly after the verdict. Reporters hurried to meet deadlines, attorneys gathered papers, and jurors quietly slipped away into the fading light. But for the Carter family, the world seemed to pause. Sarah sat on a wooden bench just outside Courtroom 3, Emily curled against her shoulder like a sleepy kitten. David stood nearby, still gripping the verdict form copy the clerk had handed him. For months, they had lived in a fog of fear. Security cameras on the house, lights left on all night, Emily waking screaming from dreams she couldn't fully describe. Now, for the first time, there was space to breathe. Claire Dawson stepped out of the courtroom and approached. She was smiling, but there was exhaustion behind her eyes. "You all right?" she asked gently. Sarah nodded, then shook her head, then laughed through tears. Relieved, tired, everything. David extended his hand. "We can't thank you enough." Claire shook it firmly. "You did the hard part." "Emily did the hard part." Sarah stroked Emily's hair. "She's only 3. I didn't know if she could do it." "She didn't just do it," Claire said softly. "She helped the jury see the truth. That's rare, even for adults." A moment later, Officer James Miller approached with Ruger. The shepherd's coat gleamed under the hallway lights. Emily perked up the moment she saw him, her face lighting for the first time all day. "Hi, doggy," she whispered. Ruger stepped forward, tail swishing once. Miller crouched so Emily could stroke the thick fur along the dog's neck. "He's proud of you," Miller said. "He knows you are brave." Emily smiled sleepily. "Good boy." Miller nodded toward Sarah and David. "For what it's worth, I've seen a lot of tough scenes. What she did today, braver than most cops I know." Sarah's throat tightened. "Thank you for bringing him. She needed him. Any time," Miller said. He rose, touched the brim of his cap, and guided Ruger away. The dog glanced back once before disappearing down the corridor. Sentencing day 2 months later, the Carters returned to the same courthouse for sentencing. Snow had begun to drift across Maplewood streets. Holiday wreaths hung on lampposts, but the family still felt the weight of unfinished business. The courtroom was quieter this time. There was no jury, just Judge Keaton, the lawyers, a few observers, and the man who had broken into their lives. Mark Talbot looked smaller than he had during trial. Jail had shaved some bravado from his shoulders. He wore an orange jumpsuit now, instead of a tailored suit. He stared at the table, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Before pronouncing sentence, Judge Keaton invited the victims to speak. David squeezed Sarah's hand. She nodded for him to go first. David rose slowly. Your Honor, my wife and I built our home to be a safe place for our daughter. When Mr. Talbot broke in, he didn't just steal electronics. He stole our peace. Our little girl, she wakes up screaming some nights. She learned what fear is far too early. His voice trembled, but he didn't cry. We're grateful for justice. But we hope the court understands how deeply this changed our lives. Sarah spoke next, voice softer, but no less steady. Emily's just starting to sleep through the night again. She knows the bad man is caught. I want her to know the world can still be safe. Keaton listened without expression, then nodded gravely. Thank you both. Claire Dawson spoke briefly, outlining Talbot's criminal history, prior theft charges, probation violations, the seriousness of a home invasion with a child present. When it was his turn, Talbot stood. His voice was rough, defensive at first, then oddly hollow. I was desperate. Lost my job. I thought the house was empty. I didn't mean to scare nobody, especially not a kid. His eyes flicked up toward Sarah and David, but slid away again. I'm sorry, no one replied. Keaton's voice was measured as he pronounced the sentence, 10 years in state prison, the maximum for first-degree burglary with a child witness under Minnesota law. He cited the trauma inflicted on a toddler and the defendant's record. David closed his eyes in relief. Sarah gripped Emily's hand. She had brought her this time, hoping closure would help. Emily didn't fully understand, but when the gavel fell, she whispered to her bunny, He's going away. Yes, baby, Sarah said softly. He's going away. The community response news of the case rippled beyond Maplewood. A local paper ran the headline, Tiny Witness, Big Courage. Toddler helps convict burglar. Regional stations picked up the story, showing courtroom sketches of Emily and photos of Ruger in his police harness. Social media lit up with comments about the quiet bravery of a 3-year-old and the unexpected heroism of a calm police dog. One parenting blog featured the case under the title, When the Justice System Listens to the Smallest Voice. Child advocacy groups praised Judge Keaton for allowing a support animal. Other courts took note. Within weeks, 2 nearby counties adopted policies permitting certified comfort dogs for vulnerable witnesses. Officer Miller and Ruger found themselves briefly famous. Local kids wanted to meet the hero dog. Miller accepted invitations to a few elementary schools, where Ruger sat quietly while children petted him and asked questions about bravery and safety. At one assembly, a little boy asked if Ruger was magic. Miller smiled. No magic, he said. Just training and kindness. Life at home for the Carters. Healing was slow but real. The first weeks after sentencing, Sarah still jumped at creeks in the night. David double-checked locks more than once. But gradually, the house felt like home again. Emily seemed lighter. She still clutched Mr. Flop at bedtime, but she slept more soundly. Some nights, Sarah caught her whispering to the stuffed bunny, Doggy helped me. I was brave. One Saturday in January, they visited the police station at Miller's invitation. Ruger trotted out to greet them in the lobby, tail wagging gently. Emily squealed, an unguarded, delighted sound Sarah hadn't heard since before the break-in. She hugged Ruger fiercely while Miller grinned. She talks about him constantly, Sarah told the officer. He'll be glad to hear that, Miller said with a chuckle. Then, kneeling to Emily's level, he said, Ruger's job is to help people be safe and brave. But you know what? You helped him too. You showed him what courage looks like. Emily's eyes grew wide. Me? You, Miller confirmed. You were the hero. Ripples beyond one case Claire Dawson. Meanwhile, was invited to speak at a legal conference about trauma-informed courtroom practices. She shared how a single calm canine had made the difference between a silent, terrified child and a witness who could tell the truth. Sometimes justice requires more than laws, she told her peers. Sometimes it requires compassion. Judge Keaton later issued a memo encouraging other judges to consider therapy or police comfort dogs in cases with young or vulnerable witnesses. Justice must be accessible, he wrote, even to the smallest among us. The story even reached the state legislature, where a representative cited Emily's courage during hearings on a bill to fund more courthouse comfort animals. A quiet night months later, on a mild spring evening, the Carters sat on their back porch. Fireflies blinked across the lawn. Emily, now a little taller and more confident, played with Mr. Flop near her parents' feet. David glanced at Sarah. "Do you think she remembers all of it?" Sarah watched their daughter chase a firefly. "She remembers enough to know she was brave. And that she's safe now. That might be all she needs." Inside the house, the nightlight still glowed faintly in the hallway, but now it was more a comfort than a shield. Sarah and David had stopped sleeping with their phones clutched in hand, stopped flinching at every creak. Emily darted back to the porch, clutching something invisible in her fist. "Look," she whispered, opening her tiny hand to reveal a captured firefly. Its light pulsed gently. Sarah smiled. "Wow, baby. You're so gentle." Emily nodded, serious. "I'm brave. Like Ruger." David's throat tightened. He pulled her into his lap, firefly and all. "Yes, sweetheart," he whispered. "Just like Ruger." What courage looks like far from the porch. At the Maplewood Police K-9 unit, Ruger dozed in his kennel after a long training day. Officer Miller filled out paperwork nearby, occasionally glancing toward the sleeping dog. The case had changed him too. He'd always believed his work mattered. Catching suspects, keeping streets safe. But helping one frightened little girl find her voice? That felt like a deeper kind of service. Sometimes, Miller thought, courage doesn't roar. Sometimes it's a tiny voice, saying two small words, "Bad man," and a gentle dog's quiet presence making that possible. The years after the trial passed more quietly than the ones before it. For the Carter family, quiet was not boring. It was precious. Emily turned 4, then 5. With each birthday candle she blew out, the nightmares came a little less often. The first winter after the sentencing, she woke one night screaming about the bad man. Sarah hurried in, heart pounding, but instead of trembling and hiding, Emily reached for Mr. Flop and whispered, "I'm safe now." Ruger helped. Sarah held her, rocking gently, until Emily's small body went limp in sleep. For the first time since the break-in, Sarah didn't cry after putting her back to bed. David noticed the difference too. He stopped checking every window 3 times a night. He and Sarah still kept the security system, but they no longer lived trapped by it. The house slowly became home again, full of warm dinners, squeals of play, and weekend pancake mornings. Starting school when Emily began preschool, Sarah worried about how much to share. Should the teachers know about the trauma? Would it make Emily seem fragile? But on the first day, Emily marched into the bright classroom with Mr. Flop tucked under one arm and introduced herself to the teacher with a smile. "Hi, I'm Emily. I like dogs." By the second week, she was drawing pictures of Ruger for art time. One crayon portrait showed a big brown dog with a shiny badge on his collar. Above it she'd scrawled, backward E's and all, "RUGR helps." Her teacher, Ms. Kelly, asked Sarah about it at pickup. Sarah explained, briefly, that Ruger was a police dog who had made Emily feel brave. Ms. Kelly's eyes softened. "Then he's part of her story," she said. "That's a wonderful anchor for courage." Other kids liked the Ruger drawings too. "Is he your dog?" one asked. Emily shook her head solemnly. He's a hero dog. He helps kids talk. The other children seemed impressed rather than frightened, which comforted Sarah more than she expected. The annual visit every spring, the Maplewood Police Department held an open house event. For 3 years in a row, the Carters attended. Emily would spot Ruger across the parking lot, squeal, and run to him with Mr. Flop bouncing under her arm. Officer Miller, now a family friend, always knelt down to greet her. By the second year, Ruger was slowing down, streaks of gray in his muzzle, but he perked up whenever he saw Emily. Miller would joke. His retirement plan includes unlimited treats from this one, as Emily fed the dog small pieces of apple from her lunchbox. At one event, Miller quietly told David and Sarah, "You know, Ruger's presence in court that day started something bigger. We've got 2 more dogs now, certified for comfort work. Judges call them in whenever a kid witness is scared." Sarah blinked. "Because of Emily?" "Because of Emily," Miller confirmed. "Her courage showed us what's possible. A different kind of hero day. When Emily was 6, her school hosted a Heroes in the Community week. Parents came to speak. A nurse, a firefighter, a postal worker. Ms. Kelly invited Officer Miller and Ruger. That morning, Emily wore her favorite t-shirt, bright pink with a cartoon dog on the front, and sat cross-legged in the front row. When Miller introduced Ruger and talked about helping people feel safe, he didn't mention Emily's case directly, just said, "Sometimes kids have to be brave and tell what they saw." Ruger helps them. Afterward, Miss Kelly asked if anyone had questions. Dozens of hands shot up. Can Ruger smell candy? Does he fight bad guys? Does he like belly rubs? Then a quiet voice spoke from the front row. "Emily. He helped me once," she said. The room went silent. Emily looked at her classmates, not shy, just calm. "I was scared to talk, but Ruger stayed with me, and then I could." Miss Kelly glanced at Sarah, who was volunteering that day. Sarah's throat closed, but she nodded. The other kids stared at Emily with wide eyes, not teasing, just awe. One boy whispered, "That's so cool." On the way home, Sarah told Emily, "I'm proud of you for sharing." Emily shrugged, smiling. "I wanted them to know dogs can help. The weight lifts trauma doesn't vanish, but it changes shape." For the Carters, the break-in shifted from an open wound to a story they could tell, cautiously at first, then more freely. David began volunteering with a local neighborhood watch, teaching about home safety without paranoia. Sarah joined a support group for parents of kids who had experienced crime. She found herself sharing Ruger's story often. "It's amazing," she'd say. "Something as simple as a calm dog can give a child her voice." Sometimes, she still dreamed of that night, the glass breaking, the shadow in the hall, but she woke to a safe home, a husband beside her, a sleeping daughter who had turned fear into strength. News from the court. 3 years after sentencing, Claire Dawson called Sarah. "Just wanted you to know, the state's comfort dog program is now permanent. They're training more dogs and handlers for child witnesses." Sarah smiled into the phone. "That's wonderful. It started with Emily," Claire said warmly. "Judges cite that case when they explain why this matters." Sarah glanced across the living room where Emily was sprawled on the rug, drawing a picture of a superhero dog with a cape. She'll love hearing that. When Sarah told her, Emily beamed. "Ruger helped lots of kids now?" "Yes, sweetheart. Lots of kids." Emily hugged Mr. Flop. "Good dog." A quiet anniversary, the anniversary of the break-in, was always strange. The Carters didn't mark it with balloons or candles, but they noticed. Sometimes, Sarah would light a single small candle and whisper thanks for safety. Sometimes David would take Emily out for ice cream, a ritual he called their brave treat. On the 5th anniversary, they drove to the edge of town where Ruger was enjoying semi-retirement with Officer Miller. Ruger was slower now, but his tail thumped when he saw Emily. Miller laughed. He remembers his girl. Emily hugged the old shepherd gently. "Thank you for helping me." Miller's eyes glistened. "He'd say you helped him too." Before they left, Miller handed Emily a small patch, the K9 unit emblem with Ruger's name stitched beneath. "For our honorary partner," he said. Emily held it to her chest as they drove home. "I'm like a helper now," she whispered. "You always were," Sarah said softly. New dreams. By age 8, Emily's bedroom walls were covered with dog posters and crayon drawings. She told anyone who asked that she wanted to work with animals when she grew up, maybe train hero dogs like Ruger. David and Sarah encouraged the dream, but never pressured it. What mattered most was that their daughter, once so terrified, now thought about helping others feel safe. Sometimes, late at night, Sarah would peek in and see Emily asleep, surrounded by stuffed dogs, Mr. Flop still among them, though a bit ragged. On the knit-stand sat the K9 patch and a photo of Emily with Ruger at the open house. Courage, captured in a frame. Ripples Continue. The Maplewood case remained quietly famous in legal circles. Articles referenced the Carter precedent when discussing child-friendly testimony procedures. New courthouses added dedicated comfort animal rooms. Judges asked to borrow the Ruger model. Officer Miller retired Ruger at 11 and adopted him officially. When Ruger passed peacefully 2 years later, Miller sent the Carters a paw print impression in clay and a note. He loved helping her. He helped many because of her. Sarah cried when she read it, then showed Emily. Now 10, Emily stroked the print. "I'll remember him forever." Looking forward, the story that had begun with shattered glass and terror had become something else entirely. A legacy of safety and compassion. On the night of Ruger's memorial, Sarah and David tucked Emily in. She placed the paw print beside Mr. Flop. "Mommy, I think I want to be a helper like Ruger when I'm big. Maybe help scared kids talk." Sarah kissed her forehead. "That would be wonderful." Emily closed her eyes and smiled. "I know how it feels. I can help." Sarah sat a moment longer, watching her daughter drift to sleep. A girl who had faced darkness, spoken 2 tiny words, and changed far more than one trial. 15 years had passed since that cold night when glass shattered and fear flooded the Carter home. Emily Carter was no longer the tiny girl clutching a stuffed bunny on a courtroom bench. She was 18 now, tall, confident, with warm brown eyes and a quiet strength that people noticed but couldn't always explain. The past was never completely gone. Sometimes a sudden noise still made her flinch, and she kept a small nightlight glowing in her dorm room. But fear no longer ruled her life. It had been replaced by something else, a steady determination to help others find safety and voice. A college path, Emily was finishing her first year at the University of Minnesota, majoring in criminal justice with a focus on child advocacy. Her dorm desk was covered in textbooks, sticky notes, and always the small framed photo of a younger Emily hugging a big German shepherd with gray around his muzzle. Most of her classmates didn't know the full story behind her career choice. When asked, she would just say, "I had help once when I was scared. I want to give that back." But in quiet essays for class, she wrote about it, about the night she whispered "bad man" and how a gentle dog named Ruger changed the direction of a trial, and eventually her life. A visit back home one bright spring weekend, Emily came home to Maplewood. Sarah and David met her at the train station, arms wide for hugs. Home looked the same. The porch swing, the oak tree she used to climb, Mr. Flop still sitting, a little threadbare, on her childhood bed. That Saturday morning, Sarah handed Emily a sealed envelope. "This came last week," she said, eyes soft. Inside was a formal letter from the Minnesota Victim Support Council. It invited Emily to speak at their annual conference, the same conference where Claire Dawson had once told Ruger's story to lawyers and judges. "They want me to." "Keynote?" Emily asked, eyes wide. Sarah nodded. "They've followed your journey. They know what you've done with your experience." David grinned. "We said yes for you. Hope that's okay." Emily laughed through tears. "It's okay." Preparing to speak, the idea of standing on stage before hundreds of advocates and judges was daunting. Emily spent weeks crafting her talk in her dorm room, pacing with note cards. She didn't want the speech to be about fear. She wanted it to be about voice. She wrote, "I was 3 when my world stopped feeling safe. I didn't have big words or a strong voice. But someone listened anyway. A gentle dog sat beside me. And in that quiet, I found enough courage to say 2 words that mattered." She added, "Every scared child holds a truth. Our job is to build the safety for them to share it." When she got stuck, she would touch the old canine patch Miller had given her years before. It still smelled faintly of dog and leather. The conference day, the conference ballroom was filled with social workers, prosecutors, child psychologists, and police officers. Many wore name tags. Some had small paw-print pins, showing they worked with courthouse dogs. Emily waited backstage, heart hammering. She spotted Claire Dawson across the room, older now, but still sharp-eyed, chatting with Judge Keaton. Officer Miller was there too, though Ruger had long since passed. Miller had a new dog now, a young golden retriever in a navy vest. Seeing them calmed her. These were the people who had stood for her when she was too small to stand alone. When her name was called, Emily stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, but she could see her parents beaming in the front row. She began quietly. "When I was 3 years old, I met a dog named Ruger in a courthouse. I didn't know what a courthouse was, really. I just knew I was scared." A ripple of smiles moved through the room. She told the story, carefully but honestly. The night of the break-in, the fear, the trial, and the moment she whispered "bad man," because a calm shepherd sat beside her. She spoke of what happened after, how Ruger's presence led to policy change, how other children now had comfort animals because someone believed a toddler's voice mattered. Her voice grew stronger. "I want to study criminal justice, so no child has to choose between silence and terror. We can build systems that let them speak safely. We can listen." When she finished, the room stood and clapped, not polite applause, but a long, heartfelt standing ovation. Claire Dawson wiped tears. Judge Keaton nodded solemnly. Officer Miller gave a small, proud salute. A private moment after the speech, Miller found Emily in the hallway. His hair was more gray now, but his eyes were warm. Beside him sat his new canine partner, a golden retriever named Bailey. "Ruger would have been proud," Miller said quietly. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "I wish he could have been here." "He was," Miller replied, tapping the canine patch pinned to Emily's jacket. "Every time another kid speaks, that's him." Emily knelt to pet Bailey, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Thank you for bringing him to me that day." Miller's voice was gentle. "Thank you for being brave. You changed more lives than you'll ever know." The man who broke in Emily had rarely thought about. Mark Talbot in recent years, but a few weeks after the conference, she learned he had been released on parole after serving most of his sentence. A victim's advocate notified the Carters as required by law. Sarah and David discussed whether to tell Emily. She was an adult now, but they worried it might shake her. When they finally sat her down, Emily listened quietly. "I'm not scared," she said at last. "He's not part of my story anymore. I moved on." David exhaled, relieved. "We just wanted you to know." Emily nodded. "Thanks for telling me. But my life isn't about him. It's about what came after. And it was true. Talbot was just a shadow in her past. Ruger, courage, and compassion were the lasting marks. Giving back that summer, Emily interned at a child advocacy center. She spent her days helping kids prepare to testify in safe, child-friendly rooms filled with toys and therapy dogs. Sometimes when a nervous child hesitated to speak, she would kneel down and say softly, "I know it's scary. I was little once too. You can do this." Her presence, calm, understanding, worked magic. One social worker said, "You have a gift. You meet kids where they are." Emily just smiled. "Someone once did that for me." Home again. On the night before she returned to college for sophomore year, Emily sat on the back porch with her parents. The oak tree rustled in the warm summer breeze. Fireflies flickered across the lawn, the same gentle light she'd chased as a little girl. Sarah handed her a small box. Inside was a silver necklace with a simple pendant, a tiny paw print. "It's to remind you," Sarah said, voice thick with love, "of who helped you and of who you've become." Emily clasped it around her neck, fingers trembling. "Thank you," David smiled. "We're proud of you, Em. More than you'll ever know." Emily gazed out into the night, the necklace cool against her skin. "I'm proud too," she whispered. "Not of what happened, but of what we made from it." Legacy. The next morning, as she packed to leave, Emily tucked Mr. Flop, still patched and loved, into her bag. Some memories were too important to leave behind. In the kitchen, Sarah scrolled through the news and found a short article. Minnesota expands comfort animal program to all state courthouses. She smiled and called Emily over. "Look, baby. It's everywhere now." Emily read the headline and grinned. Ruger would wag his tail. They laughed softly together. A future built on courage. As the train pulled away toward campus, Emily looked out the window at the shrinking town. Once, Maplewood had been the place where fear entered her life. Now it was where courage had taken root. She thought of the terrified toddler in the courtroom, of the two words that changed everything. She thought of Ruger, of Officer Miller, of every adult who made space for a small voice. Someday soon, she would stand beside another frightened child, maybe with a gentle dog at her side, and say, "You're safe. You can speak. I believe you." And somewhere, in that quiet, another truth would be told. Another life steadied, another ripple sent into the world. Emily touched the paw print pendant and smiled. The bad man had been only the beginning. The real story, the one worth telling, was about safety, hope, and the power of listening when the smallest voice dares to speak.